The first sign that everything was about to go wrong came when a consultant half my age asked me why we still kept physical compliance records. Not because he wanted to learn, because he genuinely believed they shouldn't exist. I was standing beside the records archive on the 4th floor, holding 3 folders and a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, when he looked at the shelves and laughed. "Wow," he said. "This place looks like a museum." I smiled politely. People had been making jokes about my department for years. The difference was that most of them understood why it existed. He didn't. And that turned out to be a problem. My name is Rebecca Lawson. I was 48 years old and had spent nearly 14 years working as regulatory documentation manager at Titan Infrastructure Systems. Most employees barely knew what my department did. That was normal. When compliance systems work correctly, nobody notices them. When they fail, everyone notices. Usually too late. Titan wasn't a glamorous company. We designed and maintained industrial monitoring systems used by transportation networks, energy providers, and government facilities. The kind of work that required mountains of documentation, safety certifications, audit trails, federal approvals, vendor validations, risk assessments, thousands of pages of records supporting products worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Most people hated dealing with that paperwork. I loved it, not because I enjoyed forms, because documentation tells stories. Every project leaves fingerprints. Every decision leaves evidence. If you know where to look, records explain everything. For 14 years, I had been the person who knew where to look. Then the investors arrived. New funding, new executives, new strategy, the usual corporate theater. Suddenly everyone was talking about transformation, modernization, efficiency, agility, innovation. Words that sound impressive during presentations and become exhausting after the 100th repetition. The consultants arrived shortly afterward. Young, confident, expensively dressed, armed with slide decks containing colorful diagrams, and almost no practical understanding of how the company operated. One of them was Ethan Blake. Official title: Director of Strategic Optimization. Actual specialty: making complicated things sound simple until they broke. Ethan was 31. MBA. Consulting background. Excellent at speaking for 20 minutes without saying anything specific. The executive team loved him. Employees tolerated him. I avoided him whenever possible. Unfortunately, that became difficult. About 6 weeks after the restructuring began, Ethan decided every department should justify its existence. His words, not mine. Apparently, decades of successful audits no longer counted as justification. Everything needed metrics, visibility, alignment. I remember the exact day he visited my office. Tuesday morning, 9:12 a.m. I remember because I was reviewing documentation for a federal transportation contract due the following week. A contract worth nearly $180 million. Ethan walked in without knocking. 3 consultants followed behind him carrying tablets. He looked around my office. The shelves. The binders. The archive certification files. His expression reminded me of someone discovering cave paintings. So this is documentation control. I nodded. This is documentation control. He laughed. Not maliciously. Almost worse. Dismissively. Interesting. That word should have been a warning. People like Ethan always say something is interesting right before they decide to destroy it. For the next 20 minutes he asked questions. Most of them revealed he didn't understand the answers. Why keep physical archives? Because federal regulations required them. Why maintain duplicate records? Because auditors required redundancy. Why track approval chains manually? Because automated systems occasionally fail. Each answer seemed to disappoint him. Complexity offended people who built careers simplifying things they didn't understand. When he finally left, I returned to work. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, my assistant Melissa appeared in my doorway looking worried. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" Ethan scheduled a meeting about documentation control. That got my attention. What kind of meeting? Executive review. My stomach tightened. Executive reviews rarely happened when everything was fine. The meeting took place Monday morning. large conference room, executive leadership, consultants, department heads, the entire performance. I sat quietly while Ethan presented. According to his slides, documentation control represented unnecessary operational redundancy. Too many resources, too much storage, too many legacy processes, too much dependence on specialized knowledge. I nearly laughed at that last one. Specialized knowledge was literally the point. You don't comply with federal regulations accidentally. You comply because people understand them. When Ethan finished, the CEO nodded thoughtfully, then asked a question that changed everything. What would happen if documentation control were consolidated? Ethan smiled. The smile of someone who already believed he knew the answer. Very little. Across the table, several department heads exchanged glances. Not because they agreed, because they knew he was wrong. Very wrong. But nobody challenged him. Not directly. That was the beginning. Not the disaster. Just the beginning. The disaster arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a meeting invitation titled, Role Realignment Discussion. And the moment I saw it appear in my inbox, I knew exactly where this story was headed. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Human Resources. Ethan Blake. A representative from Finance. 3 attendees. Which usually meant one thing. The outcome had already been decided. I spent the entire morning reviewing compliance documents for the transportation contract. Not because I expected the work to matter. Because it always mattered. No matter what executives decided. At 1:58 p.m. I walked into the conference room. Ethan was already there. He looked relaxed. Confident. The expression of someone who had never personally dealt with the consequences of being wrong. Beside him sat Karen from Human Resources. A thick folder rested on the table. That was never a good sign. Rebecca, thank you for coming. I sat down. Karen began reading from prepared notes. Corporate restructuring. Operational efficiencies. Strategic realignment. Resource optimization. I had worked in business long enough to translate corporate language into plain English. You are being eliminated. Eventually she reached the important sentence. Your position will be discontinued effective immediately. There it was. 14 years. Reduced to a paragraph. I listened quietly while they explained severance benefits, transition assistance, future opportunities, the usual package. Then I asked a simple question. Who will be responsible for compliance records? Ethan answered immediately. We're integrating those responsibilities into multiple departments. That response told me everything. Nobody was going to be responsible. When responsibility is spread across everyone, it usually belongs to no one. What about audit preparation? We'll automate much of that. What about certification histories? The system stores them. What about exception tracking? The software handles exceptions. Every answer revolved around software. Not processes. Not accountability. Not expertise. Software. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because they genuinely believed technology replaced knowledge. Technology amplifies knowledge. It doesn't create it. After the meeting, I returned to my office. Melissa was waiting. The moment she saw my face, she knew. They did it. I nodded. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Melissa had worked with me for 9 years. She understood the department better than almost anyone. What happens now? She asked. I looked around the office. The shelves. The binders. The project histories. Thousands of hours of accumulated organizational memory. Now they find out why this department existed. By 5 o'clock, most of my belongings were packed. Word had spread through the building. Employees stopped by throughout the afternoon. Engineers. Project managers. Quality specialists. Several department heads. Most reactions were identical. Confusion. Disbelief. Concern. One conversation stood out. David Romero from Quality Assurance closed my office door before speaking. They have no idea what you've been managing. I think you're right. No, he said. I know I'm right. David rarely spoke emotionally. The fact that he seemed angry worried me. The next audit is in 6 weeks. I nodded. I know. They don't. That was the problem. Most organizational disasters begin with people who don't know what they don't know. I left Titan that evening carrying 2 boxes. The parking lot looked exactly the same as it had every other Friday. Employees heading home. Traffic moving slowly toward the highway. Normal. That's the strange thing about major turning points in life. The world doesn't stop. Everything looks ordinary, even when nothing is. The first 2 weeks after my departure were surprisingly quiet. I updated my resume, organized years of professional notes, helped my father with a few medical appointments, tried not to think about work constantly. That part was difficult. For 14 years, work had structured my life. Suddenly the structure was gone. Then the phone calls started. The first came from David. Can I ask you something? Depends. Where are the historical variance reports for the East Transit project? I smiled despite myself. Which year? Silence. Then, see? This is exactly the problem. I explained where the reports were stored. The call ended. 2 days later another arrived. This time from procurement, then engineering, then legal. Different questions. Same underlying issue. Nobody knew how much information flowed through documentation control until the department stopped functioning. By the end of the month, former colleagues were contacting me almost daily. Not because they were incompetent. Because the systems Ethan had promised would replace institutional knowledge weren't actually replacing anything. They were databases. Databases don't explain context. They don't explain why exceptions occurred. They don't explain regulatory interpretations. They don't explain 20 years of historical decisions. People do. One evening Melissa called. She sounded exhausted. How bad? I asked. Worse every week. Apparently management had divided my responsibilities among 6 different teams. Each team assumed another team was handling critical tasks. Deadlines started slipping. Approval chains became confused. Documents were being stored in inconsistent locations. Nobody agreed on procedures. Exactly the outcome I expected. Not because I was special. Because compliance work depends on coordination. Break coordination and the rest follows naturally. Then came the first real warning sign. A month after my departure, Titan failed an internal regulatory review. Not an external audit. Not yet. An internal review. The kind designed to catch problems before regulators find them. David told me about it during a phone call. They found over 200 documentation discrepancies. I sat quietly. 200. That number was astonishing. Not because errors existed. Because they had accumulated so quickly. What did Ethan say? David laughed. Not happily. He blamed legacy processes. Of course he did. When reality contradicts a consultant's theory, reality usually gets blamed first. A week later, something even more serious happened. The federal transportation contract I had been working on before my termination entered final review. The same contract worth nearly $180 million. The same contract requiring flawless documentation. The same contract Ethan believed could manage itself. And suddenly, executives began realizing that certain records were missing. Not lost. Not destroyed. Simply impossible to locate because nobody understood how the documentation ecosystem actually worked. That was the moment panic entered the building. And once panic appears, it spreads quickly. Panic rarely announces itself. It starts quietly. A missed deadline. An unanswered email. A manager requesting an emergency meeting. Then suddenly everyone realizes the problem is much larger than they thought. That was exactly what happened at Titan. The transportation contract entered final compliance review 6 weeks after my departure. According to Melissa, executives expected a routine approval process. Instead, reviewers returned a list of documentation gaps that stretched across dozens of pages. Certification records, vendor validation histories, engineering change approvals, exception reports, risk mitigation documentation. Nothing catastrophic individually, but together they painted a dangerous picture. Not because the work hadn't been done, because nobody could prove it had been done. In regulated industries, evidence matters as much as execution. Sometimes more. A process that exists without documentation may as well not exist at all. The following Monday, David called me before 8 in the morning. They've scheduled crisis meetings all week. I wasn't surprised. What are they looking for? Everything. His voice sounded tired. The contract review team requested clarification on documents going back 7 years. I leaned back in my chair. 7 years. That meant reviewers were tracing decision histories. Never a good sign. Once auditors begin digging into historical records, they usually suspect systemic problems. What does Ethan think? David laughed. He keeps saying the issue is temporary. Temporary. Another favorite executive word. Temporary problems have a way of becoming permanent consequences. Meanwhile, my own situation was improving. The consulting work that had started slowly was expanding faster than I expected. Most projects involved compliance systems, documentation reviews, audit preparation, risk management. The exact work Titan had decided was unnecessary. Apparently, the rest of the industry disagreed. One Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Angela Pierce, Chief Operating Officer at Meridian Technical Solutions, a company nearly twice Titan's size. Rebecca. Angela. We should talk. Simple words. Serious tone. I already knew this wasn't a casual conversation. We arranged a meeting for the following week. First, I assumed she wanted consulting support. That assumption lasted approximately 10 minutes. Because as soon as the meeting began, Angela pushed a folder across the table. Inside was a job description. Vice President of Regulatory Operations. I stared at it, then looked up. You're recruiting. We are. I hadn't expected that. The position represented a major promotion. More responsibility. More authority. More influence than any role I'd previously held. Angela smiled. You seem surprised. I am. You shouldn't be. She leaned back. Your reputation is exceptional. Those words stayed with me. Because during difficult periods, people often focus on immediate setbacks. Job losses. Bad decisions. Unfair treatment. What we forget is that reputations continue existing beyond those moments. The work we do over years creates opportunities we cannot always see. For the next hour, we discussed operations, compliance strategy, team development, long-term growth, real business conversations, the kind I enjoyed. When the meeting ended, Angela stood and shook my hand. I think you'd be perfect for this. For the first time since leaving Titan, I allowed myself to imagine a future larger than the one I had lost. Back at Titan, however, the situation continued deteriorating. 3 weeks later, the transportation contract failed its final review. Not permanently, but enough to delay approval. The financial impact was immediate. Project timelines shifted. Customers demanded explanations. Executives faced difficult questions from investors. And suddenly documentation wasn't considered old-fashioned anymore. Now it was critical. Funny how quickly priorities change when money becomes involved. Melissa called me that Friday. They hired consultants. I nearly laughed. They already had consultants. More consultants. Of course they did. Organizations often respond to bad advice by purchasing additional bad advice. Apparently, a second consulting firm had been brought in to investigate operational weaknesses. Months earlier, several employees had warned management about those weaknesses. Nobody listened. Now outsiders were being paid enormous fees to explain the same problems. The pattern felt familiar. By autumn, employee morale had fallen sharply. Several experienced managers resigned. 2 department directors retired earlier than planned. Recruiting replacements became increasingly difficult. Word spreads quickly within professional communities, especially when talented employees start leaving. One evening, David and I met for coffee after work. He looked older than I remembered. More tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from spending months solving preventable problems. They finally admitted documentation control wasn't redundant. I smiled. What changed their minds? The audit findings. That made sense. Reality is persuasive. Eventually, David stirred his coffee, then lowered his voice. Do you know what the board asked during the last review meeting? I shook my head. They asked why nobody explained the risks before the restructuring. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then we both laughed. Not because it was funny, Because it was absurd. Half the company had explained the risks. The board simply hadn't wanted to hear them. Sometimes leadership mistakes aren't caused by a lack of information. They're caused by ignoring information that conflicts with preferred narratives. Several days later, Angela called again. This time with an offer. Official. Formal. Substantial. Vice President of Regulatory Operations. A compensation package that exceeded my previous salary by a significant margin. Resources to build and expand a department. Direct access to executive leadership. Most importantly, an organizational culture that valued expertise rather than dismissing it. I accepted. Without hesitation. The following month, I started my new position. On my first day, I walked through every department. Met supervisors. Engineers. Compliance specialists. Project managers. Asked questions. Listened carefully. Took notes. Exactly as I had done throughout my career. Because no matter how high your title becomes, success still depends on understanding the people doing the work. And while I was building something new, Titan was still trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. The answer was simple. But simple answers are often the hardest to accept. Especially when they reveal mistakes that could have been avoided from the beginning. The answer was simple. Titan infrastructure systems had confused information with expertise. They believed data could replace experience. They believed software could replace judgment. They believed processes could operate independently of the people who understood them. And like many organizations before them, they discovered the difference the hard way. 6 months after I joined Meridian Technical Solutions, our division completed the most successful regulatory review in company history. Not because we worked miracles. Not because we were perfect. Because we respected fundamentals. Documentation. Communication. Accountability. Consistency. The same principles that had guided my entire career. The review covered projects across multiple states, several federal agencies, and hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. The auditors spent nearly 3 weeks examining our records, interviewing employees, reviewing approval histories, tracing compliance workflows. When the final report arrived, the findings exceeded even our expectations. The auditors specifically highlighted the structure and transparency of our documentation systems. Angela forwarded the report to me with a short message. Excellent work. Simple. Professional. Meaningful. Those 2 words mattered more than most awards. Meanwhile, news from Titan continued reaching me through former colleagues. First, the updates came occasionally, then more frequently. The transportation contract delay had triggered additional reviews. Additional reviews uncovered additional weaknesses. Every investigation seemed to reveal another problem. Not because the company had suddenly become incompetent. Because years of institutional knowledge had been disrupted faster than it could be replaced. One afternoon, Melissa called. She had finally accepted a position elsewhere. I wasn't surprised. Honestly, I had expected it months earlier. How do you feel? I asked. Relieved. Her answer came instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just relief. That told me everything. Employees can tolerate stress. They can tolerate hard work. They can even tolerate mistakes. What eventually drives people away is the feeling that competence no longer matters. According to Melissa, the atmosphere inside Titan had changed dramatically. The optimism that accompanied the restructuring was gone. The excitement had disappeared. Employees who once focused on solving problems now spent most of their time documenting them. Trust had become scarce. And once trust begins disappearing inside an organization, recovery becomes extremely difficult. Several weeks later, David shared another update. The board had commissioned an independent operational review, not a consulting presentation. A real review. The kind designed to identify root causes. The conclusions were devastating. Leadership decisions. Knowledge loss. Poor transition planning. Insufficient risk assessment. Lack of stakeholder consultation. Nothing shocking. Nothing unexpected. Simply a formal confirmation of what experienced employees had been saying from the beginning. The board finally had evidence. Unfortunately, evidence arrived after the damage. Not before it. Then came the announcement everyone had anticipated. Ethan Blake was leaving the company. Officially, the departure was described as a strategic career transition. Corporate language has endless ways of avoiding uncomfortable truths. Nobody I knew believed the official explanation. His influence had gradually disappeared during the previous months. The transportation contract failure, the audit findings, the turnover, the operational instability. Eventually, even the strongest executive support couldn't overcome reality. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I felt something closer to disappointment. Because despite everything, Ethan wasn't a villain. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't corrupt. He simply believed he understood systems he had never truly taken the time to learn. And that mistake is more common than most people realize. The biggest professional failures I've witnessed rarely involved bad intentions. They usually involved overconfidence, a dangerous belief that complexity can be ignored without consequences. By the following spring, Meridian promoted me again. Not to a higher title, to a broader responsibility. I was asked to lead a company-wide operational integration initiative. 5 divisions, thousands of employees, multiple regulatory environments. The largest project of my career. Angela invited me into her office the morning the board approved it. I have a question. I smiled. That sounds dangerous. She laughed. Why do people trust you so quickly? For a moment I considered the question, then answered honestly. I don't think they trust me quickly. What do you mean? I think they trust consistency. That seemed to surprise her. So I continued. People watch what you do, not what you say. I had learned that lesson years earlier. Employees remember who answers emails, who keeps promises, who accepts responsibility, who helps during difficult situations. Trust isn't built through speeches. It's built through patterns. Small actions repeated over time. Angela nodded thoughtfully. Later that evening, I thought about the conversation while driving home. The sun was setting. Traffic moved slowly. The kind of ordinary moment people rarely remember. Yet those moments often become important when viewed in hindsight, because they allow you to measure distance. Not physical distance, professional distance. A year earlier, I had left Titan carrying 2 cardboard boxes. Uncertain, frustrated, wondering whether 14 years of work had just been discarded. Now I was leading projects that influenced an entire organization, working alongside leaders who valued expertise, building systems designed to last. The contrast felt almost unreal. A few months later, I attended an industry conference in Chicago. Hundreds of professionals from across the country attended. Executives, engineers, compliance specialists, operations leaders, the usual crowd. After my presentation, several attendees approached with questions. One conversation stayed with me. A young manager introduced herself and explained that her company was considering a major restructuring. Then she asked something simple. How do you know whether a system is truly important? I smiled, because the answer was easier than most people think. You remove it. She looked confused. I continued. If nobody notices, it probably wasn't important. A few people nearby laughed. Then I added, but if removing it creates confusion, delays, mistakes, uncertainty, and risk, you've learned something valuable. She nodded slowly. I could tell she understood. Because that's exactly what happened at Titan. The company discovered the value of documentation control only after it disappeared. A very expensive lesson. As the conference ended, I stood near the windows overlooking the city skyline. For a few minutes, I simply watched people moving through the streets below. Everyone busy. Everyone focused on their own destinations. And I thought about careers. How unpredictable they are. How quickly circumstances change. How often setbacks disguise opportunities. Losing my job had once felt like the worst professional experience of my life. In reality, it forced me toward opportunities one never would have pursued otherwise. The promotion, the new company, the larger responsibilities, the professional growth. None of it would have happened if I had remained comfortable. That's the strange thing about career setbacks. While you're experiencing them, they feel like endings. Most of the time they're transitions. Painful transitions. Unexpected transitions. But transitions nonetheless. Looking back, I don't remember the severance package. I don't remember the conference room. I don't even remember most of what Ethan said during those meetings. What I remember are the people. Melissa, David, Angela, the colleagues who valued competence, the professionals who cared about doing good work. Because at the end of every business story, every restructuring, every promotion, every failure, one truth remains constant. Companies succeed because of people. Not presentations. Not buzzwords. Not organizational charts. People. The leaders who understand that truth build organizations that endure. The leaders who ignore it eventually learn the lesson another way, usually at a much higher cost. And after everything that happened, that lesson felt more valuable than any job title I had ever held.